on what's happening as far as the early career framework's going, and Catherine Harris, my colleague from the local authority, will be speaking later about appropriate body and the changes that will be happening there. We'll hopefully give you some idea of things that you need to be looking at now and things you need to be considering to get ready for the early career framework changes in September. The next slide, please. And the next one. Thank you. So to introduce myself, then, my name is Tracy Dundas. I'm the Early Career Framework Lead at Potentia Teaching School Hub, which I'll explain in a moment. I'm currently working at St Mary's as Director of Teaching School in Chesterfield, but will from September be moving over and working just for the Hub. Catherine, Senior Advisor at Local Authority, will be talking later, as I've already mentioned, around appropriate body. Just before we actually get into the early career framework side of things, though, it's probably worth just a quick mention of Potentia Teaching School Hub. If you were able to join us a couple of weeks ago for the session that Alan Keeley, our new director, was running about it, you'll know. But if you weren't able to make that, it's just really just to explain to you what this Teaching School Hub thing is all about. As you're probably aware, there are around 900 teaching schools currently across the country, and they are going to be replaced from September with 87 teaching school hubs, which are larger organisations, and they will be replacing teaching schools. Each one of these hubs has got its own geographical area that it looks after, and our area there, you can see, is covering Amber Valley, Bolsover, Chesterfield, Derbyshire Dales, High Peak and North East Derbyshire. The remit of the teaching school hubs is this golden thread, which is looking at professional development throughout a teacher's career. So starting with ITT, moving through the early career framework, the new revised MPQs, and in addition to that, it will be looking at wider CPD, where that might be a need for that in our hub area. So more about those other things later, but today's session, as you know, is around the early career framework. Thanks, Lucy. So where this has come from then, the early career framework is born out of the teacher recruitment and retention strategy, which looked at why teachers weren't staying in the profession. And one of the things that they discovered was that we were losing quite a lot of teachers early in their careers. And one reason for that was that the support that they were getting in the training development wasn't always as good as it could be. So this early career framework then, along with the other reforms that I mentioned, is born out of this, and the hope then is that this will help us to keep some teachers within the system, and more importantly, to keep some of our good and potentially good teachers in Derbyshire. What the framework does is it sets out what all early career teachers should be learning in the first 2 years. Now, there is an understanding and appreciation that most schools have got some sort of framework or some sort of training and induction in the first year, but what this is doing is looking at something that's going to be more consistent across the country and actually based around a framework, which we'll look at in a moment. Thanks, Lucy. So what schools will get out of this is that they get 2 years of funded training. They are high quality materials. Some of these materials you can access already if you've not done on the gov.uk website, if you look under early career framework. There is funding for 5% time away from the classroom for teachers in their second year. Now the question there might come, well, what about the funding for the first year? And the DFE is saying that that funding is already there. So if you've got a new teacher in your school in the first year, then there will be funding within your core funding to cover the time away from the classroom, the 10% that teacher has. This is additional funding so that that new teacher can have 5% away from the classroom in the second year. There's also an expectation that the early career teachers will have a mentor in schools. Again, this is something that is common in the majority of schools, but this time it's stipulating that each new teacher should have a mentor for those 2 years, and there is also funding to cover that too, and training for the mentor if you cover one of the routes that I will explain in a moment. And there are 3 routes through this that you can choose. Next slide, please. So what's actually changing then? So this slide then is just showing you what the differences are between what's happening currently with the 1 year and what's going to be happening from September 2021. It's worth mentioning that NQTs, as we call them now, for 1 year, we'll lose that. We'll no longer use the NQT acronym. Instead, we'll be looking at ECTs, or early career teachers. So for those 2 years, instead of NQTs and RQTs, we'll be looking at early career teachers in those 2 years. So as mentioned then, 1 year currently for the induction, 2 years it will be from September, and Catherine will talk more about what the induction actually means as far as the assessment side of things goes. So currently then it's expected that an NQT, as they're called now, will have a 10% reduction in their timetable for each year. From next year, we're looking at that 10% reduction still in year 1, so nothing changed with that one, but this 5% reduced timetable in year 2 as well. So a 90% timetable in year 1, 95% timetable in year 2. There isn't currently, excuse me, any defined content. So schools are at liberty to decide themselves the input and the training that they want to give to their new teachers. From September, then it needs to be based around the early career framework. And as I mentioned, there are 3 routes through this and 3 possible options schools will have, which I'll outline in a moment. Again, this year, currently, at the moment, most schools have got a mentor, as I mentioned, but that actual role isn't definitely defined. And quite often that role is taken by one person who also takes up the induction tutor role. So from next year, there will need to be 2 roles in school. So what this means then is that there will be a mentor in school, a mentor that works to support the early career teacher, and then there will be an induction tutor, which probably will be a senior leader within the school that will oversee what's happening with the early career teachers and also oversee the assessment side of things. I think it's important to point out that the early career framework isn't assessed. It's not an assessment tool, it's a support tool, but the appropriate bodywork that Catherine will talk about later is still there, and that will cover the assessment side. So there are 2 parts to this new induction. There is the early career framework, the support, as I mentioned, and the appropriate body, which is the assessment side. So whereas they are separate, there are obviously crossovers between the 2. And we're expecting and looking here that there will be 2 roles within school, so that those 2 roles are seen as separate by the early career teachers and also by the mentor and induction tutor. Now, having said all that, we appreciate that in a small school it might not be possible to have 2 separate people doing these roles. So I think it's understood by the DFE that it can be the same person if you're not able to have 2. But it needs to be quite clear that those 2 roles and the responsibilities and what happens within those roles is separate, and that the early career teacher will know if they're in an assessment mode, if you like, or if they're in support mode. But ideally there would be 2 people there. The assessment as now will be marked against the teacher standards, but the formal assessment points are different, and Catherine, as I said, will talk about that later and explain to you how that side of things has changed. Funding we've mentioned there, so I'm just talking now for the early career framework. Currently, funding for induction is included as part of the core school budget for year 1. That will continue with the new induction process, but there will also be funding, as I mentioned, for year 2. And that funding will cover time off timetable for the new teacher, for the early career teacher, as well as the mentor. If you take one of the routes that I'm going to explain to you in a moment, there will be additional funding so that the mentor can have training as well, and for backfill that mentor as they go out. So a bit more about that in a moment. Currently, as you'll be aware, an NQT can progress up the pay scale after the first year, and that will continue. So even though induction is taking 2 years, an NQT can still progress up that pay scale if appropriate after 1 year. So don't have to wait until the end of induction for that. And then the role of the appropriate body, that will be an enhanced role whereby they will be looking at checking on the ECT and whether or not the school is actually putting in place an appropriate programme for them. And again, Catherine will talk more about that in a moment. Thanks, Lucy. So I mentioned that there were three ways that a school can navigate this and to work through it. So each early career teacher will have 2 years of funded training, but there are 3 ways that they can receive this. So I'm just going to go through these 3 different options and talk a little bit about what each one will mean. So the first option there is to work with a provider. So a provider such as Potentia Teaching School Hub, we will be delivering this programme within Derbyshire, or there may well be another provider that you choose to work with. But what this will mean then, if you choose this option, which is called the full induction programme, is the time off timetable for early career teacher that I mentioned, the 10% to the 5%. There is a 2-year programme based on the early career framework and self-directed studies for those teachers, but training will be delivered by us and training will be delivered to the mentor and to the early career teacher as well. There is funding, as I mentioned, that funding is for the 2nd year. And in addition, if you go down this route, there will be additional funding for the mentor as well, for training for the mentor. So that is probably the less burdensome option for a school. And that will be checked by the appropriate body, but Catherine will talk about that later too. So basically, if you go down that one, all of the training is done for you. It's around about 1 session per term, as well as webinars and online materials as well for the early career teacher, a bit less for the mentor. But that training is fully funded, so no cost at all to the school, and you get additional funding, as I mentioned, for backfill with that. So that's probably, as I mentioned, the less burdensome option. You could though go for the core induction programme, which is the middle one here. So instead of working with a provider, you can go on the DFE website and download materials that they've got on there. So they've got these programmes already on that platform. So you can download that, and then you can design your own or schedule your own programme using those materials. And that will be checked also by the appropriate body to make sure that that programme is actually fulfilling the requirements. Or you could do it all yourself. So you can go right back to the early career framework document itself, and you can design your own programme to go for those 2 years. Now, I did mention that the first one is less burdensome because it's all done for you. If you choose either of the other 2 options, then obviously there is some work around scheduling that programme for the middle one and also designing it from scratch if you go for the end one. And as I say, there will be accountability for this to the appropriate body, who will be making sure that whichever route you take, it's an appropriate standard. Okay, so that's the first thing really for schools to look at, which one of those options they would prefer to go to. Thanks, Lucy. Now, you will be getting a letter if you've not already had it sometime this week. I say a letter, it probably comes as an email from the DFE. So that's expected to come out to schools this week. And what that will be doing is explaining these reforms. So it will be explaining the new MPQs, the ITT reforms, and also the early career framework reforms. And also as part of that, they will be introducing this DFE online service. So when you've got an early career teacher, when you've employed an early career teacher, and you're thinking about which training program you're going to be using, you'll need to register that on this DFE online service platform. So just looking at those 3 options that I described before, if you go for the first option, which is the first column there, you will need to, when you log on to this program, when you log on to the platform, you'll need to nominate your school's induction tutor, select your school's delivery route. What that means is whether you're going for the full induction program or the core induction program. If you're going the DIY route, you don't need to register at all on that one. So you'll need to indicate if you're going full induction or core induction. Estimate your number of early career teachers and mentors, and put in the details when you actually know them. I think it's appreciated that you may well still be recruiting up until the summer, and sometimes I know it may well be into the summer also. So it's not expected that you do this until you've got those mentors and ECTs in place. We don't have a deadline. The DFE have not given a deadline for this, but what they have indicated, it will be open for you to do that up until the start of the induction, which will be obviously be in September. So what you need to do then, if that's the route you want to take, the full induction, is to look at which lead providers are available in your area. I've mentioned Potentia is Teachers Go Hub will be offering this in the Derbyshire areas that I described and mentioned earlier on, but there may well be other providers that you would want to go to. I think the DFE's preferred route is that you work with the provider in your area, but again with the understanding that some schools will have links already, perhaps a part of a MAT that might be based in a different teaching school hub geographical area, or you maybe have strong working relationships with somebody else that is offering this, and it's okay, you can go out of county, out of Teachers School Hub area if you want to, but I think the preferred option is that you stay within the Teachers School Hub if you can. You need to select an appropriate body, as you do anyway already, and to speak to that appropriate body about what sort of what you would need to do to make sure that you're following the early career framework as expected. So that's if you do the first one. So basically with that one, you just register in your school and the details, and you're thinking about which appropriate body you want to be working with. If you went for the core induction, you'd register as I've described before, the same, but this time you would need to go online on the DFE website, as I mentioned before, to have a look at the materials. There are 4 sets of materials. They're all slightly different, although obviously based around the framework, and to look which one of those you would want to use and deliver. And then again, talk with the appropriate body about what the expectations are as far as demonstrating that you're actually providing a 2-year programme for your early career teacher. If you go the DIY route, then what you need to be doing, you don't by the way, you don't register with the online service. If you're going on the DIY route, you don't need to do that. You will need to look at the early career framework, the raw document itself, select an appropriate body, and then talk to that appropriate body about what it is you need to do, again to demonstrate that you're actually providing this programme as it should, and look at writing that programme as well. So just to mention again, if you're going the DIY route, you don't need to register on this service. Likewise, if you don't have an early career teacher starting next year, you don't need to register either, but it's useful, I think, to familiarise yourself with it, just so that you know for when you do need to register one. Thanks, Lucy. So I mentioned the funding that you would get in this. Again, just a reminder that the DFE will say that, or do say that the funding for the first year is already within your budget, within your CARD budget, so there's no extra funding for year 1. But for year 2, for each early career teacher, there'll be £1,200, and for each mentor there will be £900. Now it's worth mentioning at this point that if an early career teacher changes schools, it is the second school. If they change schools in the middle after the first year, it's the second school that will get this funding. The information to be able to get the funding will be taken from your workforce census, so there is no burden on school to supply this other than the normal routes that you would go through. There'll be provision within that census to indicate how many ECTs in the second year you've got. So whichever of those 3 routes that I mentioned you go down, you will get this money for your mentors and early career teachers. If you go down the first route, working with a provider, then there will be additional funding, which allows your mentor to go out of school, and that will cover 36 hours of backfill time for your mentor to attend training. Now, we don't have an exact figure at the moment. We think it's going to be around about £800 for that, but we're waiting for confirmation from the DFE on actually how much that funding will be. So just quick summarise then, whichever route you take of those that I described earlier, you will get £1,200 for an ECT and £900 for a mentor. And if you go with the full induction, you will get additional training in the second year for mentor backfill for their training. Thanks, Lucy. Okay. So this slide is just a pointer of things that it's worth looking at right now. So if you go with decide to go with the full induction, then it's probably best in the first instance to contact us or another provider that you'll be interested in working with, and we've got our contact details at the end of this slide. So that's probably the first thing to do. Ahead of September, it's looking at your timetabling and making sure that for your early career teachers, and bear in mind you'll only have year 1 early career teachers from September, so just to make sure that they've got that 10% reduction in timetable, and that you've got an induction tutor and mentors in mind, and sign up then for the online service. If you're going with the second option, which is the core, then again you'd look at the timetabling, make sure that that reduction is there, and sign on for DFE services, but also have a look at the published materials that are on the gov.uk site, pick which one suits you best, and contact your appropriate body to find out what it is you need to do to make sure that you're compliant this framework. And the DIY one, again, look at the early career framework, start designing your programme and your training, and again, speak with your appropriate body to make sure that you are actually doing what it is that you need to do to fulfil that. And no requirement to sign on the online services that I mentioned before if you go down that route. Okay, thanks, Lucy. So just a little bit of clarification here, because I've mentioned providers and possibly delivery partners in that. Just a clarification between the two, because what you may see is this term new providers, and what that is the 6 organisations that nationally have been awarded the licence to and the contract to design these materials and QA and actually run the programmes. So there are 6 organisations you can see there. Each teaching school hub or other organisation that will be delivering this framework, they're called or named as delivery partners. So we will be a delivery partner, and we will be working with the Education Development Trust. So their programme is the one that we will be using, and basically what that will be made up of is face-to-face, around 1 each term for an early career teachers, face-to-face, Zoom if we're not able to get face-to-face, workshops, training sessions for them. In addition to that, there'll be webinars and also reading materials. For the mentors, there will be 2, I think it is, in the first year sessions, and also there will be peer discussions, so they'll be matched up with a peer who's in a similar situation, and there'll be the opportunity for some coaching, co-coaching there, as well as some materials online and webinars too. So there's more details about that coming out. Our website address will be at the end of the presentation, and there is more information about the actual detail of the programme just today gone on there. Just a word of warning though, our website is in the process of being made, so it's a bit rough and ready at the moment, but we thought it would be useful to put the information there so that you can access it, and we'll give you the address for that at the end of the presentation. Okay, so I think that's me done, Lucy. We've gone to the next slide. I'm going to pass over to Kathy now to talk about the appropriate body. Thank you.
Lovely, thank you very much, Tracy. Okay, hello everybody. It's lovely to have some familiar names on the call who I know today. If I haven't worked with you before, or you don't know me, my name's Kathy Harris and I'm a Senior Advisor for School Improvement with Derbyshire. Sometimes it says Catherine Harris, depending on how formal and fancy I feel like being, but one and the same person, it's both myself. I'm going to say next for Lucy. I don't feel that I can say next slide, please. That phrase has been destroyed for me. I don't know if it has for you as well. So next, please, Lucy. Okay, this is what I'm just going to talk about a little bit today. If you have any questions, please pop them into the chat and I'll try and come to them at the end. So I'm going to give you a quick background. If you haven't worked with us as an appropriate body or employed any NQTs recently, I'll give you a quick background of where we are now and then what will happen from the changes from September. I'll talk about the role of that we have as an appropriate body, some examples of good practice that we provide. I will talk about reductions and extensions. We've had a few questions about that, and I'll talk about the fidelity checks, which is a new role to the appropriate body in terms of the adherence to the ECF. So I'll talk a bit more about that shortly. Okay, next please, Lucy. Previously, and where we are now, before the changes come into force in September, well, Derbyshire's held the appropriate body service for schools within Derbyshire and beyond. So many of you might use us as an appropriate body. Other institutions can also hold appropriate body status, such as teaching schools have held that status previously, and schools have always had the option of choosing what appropriate body service they want to use. And the appropriate body service supports the induction for newly qualified teachers as they are now. Okay, next please. From September, as you know, we've spoke quite a lot about it, and if you get lost in the acronyms, don't worry, we all do. Our NQTs will be referred to as early career teachers. That name will change. Any NQT that's an NQT now and won't have finished their induction by the end of this academic year, they will continue on the old scheme, really, and they have until September 2023 to complete that induction on the old, where they have 1 year to do their induction. After September 2023, if an NQT hasn't completed their induction, there'll be an expectation that they then changed, it becomes the 2-year process. I can talk to you more about that later if there's any bespoke questions about that. But our NQTs will be known as early career teachers. The new statutory induction will become the early career framework, which is what Tracy's been talking to you all about. And there has been updated guidance for appropriate bodies. The link is there, but what I'll do is I'll pop it in chat shortly, so you've got direct access to it if you wanted to have a look at the roles and responsibilities of appropriate bodies. Okay, next, please. It's important to remember that the early career framework doesn't replace the appropriate body service. They are two separate things. So what you've got to try and think about is that the early career framework is that high quality CPD provision for our early career teachers. Before, there hasn't been a statutory framework for our NQTs. It's been best practice to support our NQTs, but there hasn't been a statutory framework. So this provides a statutory framework for our professional development for our early career teachers. And as Tracy mentioned, it's to have that positive impact on our early career teachers on the retention rates. Okay, next, please. So the role of the appropriate body then, well, this is kind of a section that's taken from the appropriate body guidance, and much of what the appropriate body does now will remain the same going forward. So we must ensure that our early career teachers are receiving their statutory entitlements in terms of the reduced timetabling. But if I ask you to go on to the next slide, please, Lucy. The section that's highlighted, there you go, that highlighted part is the new part. So appropriate bodies will also be expected to check that our early career teachers are having that programme of support based on the early career framework. Okay, next please, Lucy. So appropriate bodies are there to support schools and teachers in many different ways. They've got two core functions in terms of how appropriate bodies support schools. So if we go on to the next slide, please. I can see Lucy's camera's moving, so I'm sure she's just moving on to it shortly. Okay, while I'm just waiting, while it changes, I'll just let you know the next slide, there we go, is the support, the monitoring of the support. So appropriate bodies will, as I said before, check that your early career teachers are receiving their statutory entitlements and that it has due regard to the statutory guidance, and appropriate bodies must provide the fidelity checks. Don't worry if your internet's having a bit of a wobble. I think ours is a bit slow as well, so hopefully I'll catch up, but the slides will be sent to you, so you'll be able to look at them as well. And appropriate bodies must make sure that the early career teacher is having access to that high quality programme support. So we'll be carrying out fidelity checks on those schools. If the school chooses to create their own programme based on the early career framework, that DIY option that Tracy spoke about, then there will be fidelity checks to that. If a school chooses to go with a provider, such as Potentia, who are providing the early career framework, then the appropriate body does not need to do the fidelity checks because the checks have already been in place and that programme has already been approved. It's when a school is devising their own that the appropriate body will have a greater overview of what that programme. Okay, next please. The second core role that I talked about will be assessments, and again this is something that appropriate bodies have always done, and the guidance does say that appropriate bodies make the final decision on whether an early career teacher has satisfactorily met the teacher standards. It's always been that case, and if you have NQTs now, you'll know that you send reports into Derbyshire through NQT Manager, which is the online programme that we use, and we will use those to agree that final decision of whether an NQT is passed. So moving forward, whether an early career teacher will have passed. But it's always based on recommendations from the head teacher and the assessment reports that have gone beforehand. Okay, next please. The guidance also talks about examples of good practice. So what you can see there is an example of good practice that appropriate bodies are encouraged to provide. Now, we offer these elements within our appropriate bodies service, so we will continue to offer free sessions for our early career teachers and the induction tutors to develop an understanding of their roles and responsibilities. In the sessions, we will provide handbooks with expectations, examples of documentation, and we'll explain how to use the NQT Manager system if you aren't familiar with that. We also offer advice on support plans and supporting and managing currently an NQT, but moving forwards into an ECT if they are not meeting the standards. And this will include telephone and email support. In our virtual world, it'll be team meetings, one day maybe face-to-face meetings, fingers crossed. And we will support our ECTs with contacting their union representatives if necessary, and offer the impartial advice to both tutors, head teachers and early career teachers. Okay, next please. Just to go over some of the important points to note for the assessment. As you know, it's going to 2 years, we've spoken about that. Now, an early career teacher's performance will be based on the teacher standards, as it is currently for our NQTs. We're not using the ECF as an assessment tool. That's a programme of professional development support. ECTs will still be assessed on the teacher standards. So from September, there'll be 2 formal assessment points, one midway through and one at the end. And then there'll be regular reviews to monitor to make sure that an ECT is on track. So what that will look like is in year 1, you'll have your autumn and spring monitoring assessment, are we on track? And then in summer of year 1, you'll have a formal assessment. And then in the second year, you'll have an autumn and spring, are we on track? And you'll have a summer formal assessment. So right now, schools will be used to, if you have NQTs, you'll be used to writing 3 formal assessment reports and sending those into NQT Manager. That will change to 2 formal assessments at the end of each year, and then with a regular termly review of whether an early career teacher is on track or not. The guidance tells us that appropriate bodies must know the progress of any early career teacher who's deemed to not be on track, and it's also good practice to find out if all of our ECTs are on track. And I expect this will be through NQT Manager. We're still looking at working with NQT Manager moving forwards. They are looking at changing their assessment and what that report looks like. I haven't got a final version of what that might look like yet, but we are working with NQT Manager on that. Okay, next please. Reductions and extensions are something that I've had some questions about. So as it says on there, if you have an NQT now, you'll be aware that the minimum length of an induction remains at 1 term. So for an NQT to be able to have their induction starting at a school, they have to have a minimum of a 1-term contract, and that'll be the same for our early career teachers moving forwards. In terms of reductions, well, as set out in the statutory guidance, and again, I'll put a link to it in the chat, it's in very exceptional and individual cases that a head teacher or an early career teacher might request a reduction to the induction period. And this is based on the fact that early career teacher is already meeting the teacher standards. It needs to be evidence-based, and it'll be the appropriate body's role to consider whether the early career teacher has significant prior teaching experience or is already demonstrating they've met the teaching standards, for example, if they've gone through the assessment-only route. At that point, the head teacher can write to the appropriate body and request the option of a possible reduction, and that'll be based on meetings and evidence gathered. Again, it's only in exceptional circumstances that the appropriate body would consider that. In terms of an extension, again, it's only in exceptional circumstances, especially moving forwards as our induction goes to 2 years. And an appropriate body must decide on a case by case whether an induction needs extending. The guidance tells us really clear reasons why this might be the case. It says that we can only look at extending if the ECT has a good chance of meeting the standard with additional time, or if the ECT has a good chance of meeting the standard with additional support through the ECF programme, or whether the ECT has demonstrated that they've got a strong desire to improve their performance. So there's 3 core reasons why we might merit an extension. Again, it has to be a written request from schools, and then a meeting will take place. And again, it's in exceptional circumstances that might be considered. Part-time. Now, you can employ an ECT part-time, of course, as you can employ an NQT part-time, but we talked about the minimum length must be at least a term with a school to go towards an induction period. Now, the guidance tells us that if we have an ECT who's working part-time, for example, a 0.5, it would then take them 4 years to complete that induction length. The guidance says that if a part-time early career teacher who's worked for the length of 2 years, but not the equivalent of, so they've worked for the length of 2 years, then schools can request that that ECT has their induction brought to that 2-year point rather than the 4 years. The guidance only talks about 0.5 contracts. It doesn't talk about less than that. And we are seeking guidance for those ECTs, because anything less than 0.5 would take a lengthy time for the early career teacher to pass their induction. So there is the option of that for a 0.5 or above early career teacher, but it's something that we're seeking clarification on. Okay, next please. Now, we've talked quite a bit about these fidelity checks, and so what are they? Well, if you are looking at the full induction programme where you're working with a provider like Potentia and you're following their programme, then you don't need the fidelity checks because that programme has already been approved. If you want to do the core programme where you're going to deliver it yourself based on the materials that are freely available, but you're going to deliver it yourself, then the fidelity checks will need to happen. And if you're going to be a school-based programme where you're going to completely design your own programme of development based on the ECF, again, you'll need to do the fidelity checks. It's recommended that the fidelity checks are 3 throughout each year. One at the very start to check what have you designed, how have you made sure it's linked closer to the ECF, what's your programme, and then 2 throughout the year, you'd imagine termly, to make sure that programme is happening and is happening as it was planned. So there are examples of the pro forma that an appropriate body might use. So it's a form that an appropriate body would use to fill out, and there are examples of that at the back of the guidance that I'll pop into the chat, so you can see the kind of questions that you might be asked. We're going to work, or I'm going to work, with the East Midlands Appropriate Body Network to make sure that the forms that we use are the same for the whole of the East Midlands, so that any of our ECTs that move in and out of area will still have the same fidelity checked form. So it's to make sure that streamlinedness is happening across the East Midlands. So you can see examples of what the form might look like, but I can't show you a finalised form yet, as we're still working on exactly what it'll look like. Okay, next please. I've talked about the East Midlands Network, just to say that I'm part of the East Midlands Appropriate Body Network. So what I do is streamlined across different areas of the East Midlands. So any ECTs that move around, they'll be getting the same provision. Shared minds, we'll have shared good practice. So it's really great to be part of that. And any advice that you ask me for often comes from the East Midlands Network. So you know that it's not just coming from me. Okay, next please. Okay, and you have that already, but just make a note of it if you want it, if you don't have it, or if you haven't used us before as an appropriate body. That's my email, and the NQT support, the NQT at email will make its way to me as well. So if you want to make a note of those and ask me any questions, that's absolutely fine, and please do so. I'm just going to open my chat and have a quick look if there's any questions that I can answer now, or we might have to ask them at the end. Do you know how many assessment reports there will be? I think we've talked about that. You might have asked me that just before I talked about it, so hopefully that'll answer it for you. Are the written assessment reports via NQT Manager still required? So my answer is yes, but I can't tell you exactly what that will look like. I imagine what we will do is in term 1 and 2, we'll ask you for a very simple, are they on track? And in the 3rd term, we'll ask you for a written report. And in the 2nd year, I imagine the term 1 and 2 will be a simple, are they on track? And the term 3 will be a written report. That's what I imagine it will be. Again, I'm working with NQT Manager and the East Midlands Appropriate Body Network. And we actually have a meeting on Friday with NQT Manager to see exactly what that's going to look like for schools. We are still going to be using NQT Manager. Okay, lovely. There are a few questions about mentors, but I think we'll come to those at the end when we do a bit for Q&A. And someone said, apologies for all the questions. Don't worry, we'll come and answer those shortly. Okay, lovely. Thank you very much, Tracy.
Thank you. Thank you, Catherine. That's great. Just a couple more slides from me, really, just a reminder of things to be thinking about doing now before we come on to the Q&As. Choose an appropriate body, obviously the first thing to do, to look at there. If you're looking at the full induction, the first option that we talked about there, then contact your lead provider. So if you're wanting to come with Potentia, then get in touch with us for more information about that. If you're choosing the core, or if you're choosing the DIY, then look at the appropriate materials that are available online at the moment and think about how you're going to put that programme together. You'll then need to register with the DFE, as I explained earlier on. That letter should be coming to you this week if it's not already got to you, where you need to indicate your induction. Well, first of all, which of the programmes that you're going to go with, and then your induction tutor and your ECTs when you know who they are. So they're the first things really to be thinking about. We'll be giving more information about the detail of the programme that we're delivering later on, but I think for the first instance, it's just thinking about which of those routes that you want to go down. Thanks, Lucy. And just before the Q&A, Lucy, are you able to put our website address in the chat? Can you just go back? Thanks. Yeah, so obviously I mentioned gov.uk. I'm currently, as I mentioned earlier on, at St Mary's in Chesterfield. So if you want to contact me directly, then please do so on that email address. Alternatively, if you send any queries to info@potentia.co.uk, then that will get through to us, and Catherine's email address is down there too. And if you want to have a look more detail about the Education Development Trust programme that we will be running, as I mentioned before, that's on our website.